Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week I wanted to touch on a topic that I haven't really talked about very much, and it's something that sooner or later is going to come up in pretty much every Chronicle we ever run. And in short, I want to talk about combat. More specifically, I want to talk about the do's and don'ts of creating a good combat and running a good scene as a storyteller, and how you can avoid some of the problems that I've seen lots of people deal with, regardless of which particular game or which particular sphere they're running in either a World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness game. This is obviously not an exhaustive list, but it is some of the bigger potholes you can fall into and some of the easier ways to make things a little better for your players and to make things a little more memorable for your Chronicle going forward. Now, if you have anything that works particularly well at your table or at your LARP and that you want included that isn't in this list, please feel free to put in the comments below. If there's enough comments on the subject, I might make a follow-up video to this. But before we get too involved in that, let's start with the do's of combat. So, you've reached that point where violence is going to happen. Maybe this is a big battle where you've been building up all the tension and players are finally pulling out all the big toys they've been saving up, whether it's their powers on their sheet or they've been just acquiring military hardware. Maybe it's just kicking in the front door to the club that's been telling them they can't come in and they're going to get into a brawl with a bunch of bouncers. Whatever the situation is, combat is happening. You, as a storyteller, have a lot of tools available to you, but there's also a lot of easy mistakes you can make. And one of the first things to keep in mind is that if your player characters outnumber the individuals they're fighting, that gives them an inherent advantage. For folks who have not heard the term before, this is referred to as action economy. And that's just a fancy term for how much stuff can you do on your turn. If you have 4 or 5 player characters and one enemy they're all fighting, that one enemy gets a single set of actions for 4 or 5 people. That's not a great winning strategy. It's generally speaking why whoever it is that brings the most troops to the field wins. And a lot of storytellers will make the mistake of trying to pull out one big bad, one monster, and having everybody gang up on it. And then they wonder why it is players either stomp that one creature into the floor, or why that one creature is so powerful it was able to wipe out 3 or 4 player characters all in a go. And it's because it's a very difficult line to walk to have one thing versus that many people, and to make it strong enough to hold up to them without so strong that it just rolls over them. So the first thing you should do is get out of that mindset. It doesn't really work in any role-playing game. Anyone who's ever attempted to have a bunch of players fight a dragon in Dungeons & Dragons can confirm this. But the more enemies you have, the more stuff that's going on, the easier it is to balance out that action economy. So while you don't always have to have squad versus squad combat, that's one way of doing it. If you're, for example, running a werewolf game and you want to have your players get a real challenge, don't try to make one werewolf capable of taking on an entire pack of enemies. Make a pack of bad guys. Or if you're storming into a facility, have them fight an entire squad of response individuals for the personnel. Don't just try to give them one guy. That will either end up being too easy and you'll feel like you wasted everyone's time, or it'll be way too hard and your players will wonder what the heck it is they just ran into. Second, remember that situational negatives exist. And this is something that a lot of storytellers have issue with, and this is not just a World or Chronicles of Darkness issue. This is something that happens in RPGs across the board of when combat starts, 9 times out of 10, if you feel like things are way too easy, if your players are just rolling over everything, if they're far too powerful, ask yourself if you had them fighting in an open blank room with good lighting and clear sight lines. Because a lot of the time, that's what we end up doing just because we don't think to change that challenge up. And that can be a serious problem. In World and Chronicles of Darkness, you have all kinds of situational negatives that can modify the dice pools your players have. And if you have characters built for combat, this is what they're on the board to do, they're going to start throwing around really big numbers of dice. And if you're doing a LARP system, that can get even more difficult to fight against because the numbers are just tweaked so much in the player's favor. But if you have someone who's throwing around 11, 12 dice, that's a lot. It's not the most you can get, but it's a very respectable amount. Out of that, you're very likely to get a couple of successes. But when you start eating into that dice pool, suddenly the challenges start changing. So let's take that very talented combatant. They're on the field, they have their enemy in front of them, it's their turn. Let's say you have a fencer. So you have the dexterity, plus their weaponry, plus their specialties, plus the bonus equipment from their weapon, plus any other magical abilities. So let's say we're looking at 12 dice. They're just throwing around their masterful swordsman. Now, to subtract from that, you have your enemy's defense. Maybe 2 or 3, not a huge deal. So you're down to 9 or 10 dice. Still good. But let's say the individual's wounded, and now they have a wound penalty to all their attacks. So there's another 1 or 2 dice that are taken away. They're in a dim room and they don't have any way to deal with the dark lighting. Or maybe there's a storm outside. You're fighting in action movie style weather. That's another couple of dice taken off. And so on and so forth until they only have 4 or 5 dice they're throwing. And it's not something I recommend punishing players with, and it is something you should also apply to your enemies. But everything from armor to defense to cover to the weather in the room to the lighting, all of these things have situational negatives. And it's something that we often forget to apply to the formula as storytellers, and we wonder why our enemies and why our player characters have such huge dice pools, and it feels like you're playing rocket tag with everybody just either missing completely or utterly destroying their target. Remind yourself that there's an in-between stage, and it's often because we're forgetting that you're supposed to be taking these dice out of the pool because of the situation. And it also is a good representative of how things change as combat goes on, because people get injured, positioning changes, all of these things should play a role, and forgetting those can be an issue. Applying them can suddenly make things feel a lot more high pressure, and it can make things feel a little bit more difficult without changing any rules or pulling out any ridiculous equipment on the part of your enemies. Third, and this is something that a lot of storytellers either forget to do, or it's easy to get lost in the fog of war, as it were, is give your enemies good strategy. And it's not really a game mechanic, it's not something you can throw in as far as a power goes, but everything that happens in our games is our decision, and that includes the strategy our enemies use. And whether that's having beasts attack your players in pack formation, so that you have people that are flanking, people that are ganging up on a single target, because that also comes with negatives to your defense the longer you've been attacked by more people in one round. But it could also mean using gas grenades and smoke to soften up the target before they kick in the door. It could mean communication devices and radioing position to other units to come in for help. It could mean a whole lot of things, and a lot of the time we as storytellers end up just forgetting that. And good strategy can often be what completely changes a fight. As an example, vehicular combat is something a lot of us just sort of forget about. But if you hit a werewolf with a car, there's a very good chance that they're going to be in serious pain. And cars are something that we just have laying all around in the modern world. Most enemies will have them, at least a few. And that's just one of those strategies of you could pull that out. You shouldn't rely on it all the time. But just having mobile enemies or having larger weapons, unexpected tactics, these things can all make a big difference, and they can keep your players on their back foot and having to adjust and come up with their own strategies. And that can really change the nature of combat. It can keep things flowing and keep things fun and unpredictable, rather than just having players and the enemies square up on the side of each side of the line of scrimmage and go at it until everybody falls down. That's something you want to avoid, is if combat feels like it's a foregone conclusion, you may as well not waste time with the dice. But if every time initiative is called for, players start to wonder, is this the time that we're going to bite it? Then you might be doing it right. However, those are 3 things I recommend storytellers keep in mind, and 3 things they do. There are also 3 things I recommend we all not do, and those include... And now we get into the mistakes section. These are 3 things that I've seen storytellers fall into, whether you're running combat occasionally or whether it's a major part of your game. These are very easy pitfalls to fall for, and they can end up making combat feel like more of a slog, or more like players are being punished for attempting to solve a problem using violence. And that is not a feeling you should be giving your players, but at the same time, it's also important to remind yourself that no advice is absolute. There are going to be situations where these might feel like good ideas, but really ask yourself whether this is something you need to do in this situation, and if you find yourself doing this a lot, maybe reconsider your strategy. And first things first, do not negate your players' powers. And when I say that, I don't mean that you should never have counters to things that players are doing. You should never have enemies who can deal with what it is they're throwing down, particularly if the enemies that they're facing are also supernatural creatures. What I am saying, though, is that if you have a particular power on your player's sheet, let's say, for example, you're playing a changeling game, and people can turn invisible. And so that will allow them a great deal of stealth. It'll mean it's very difficult to attack them directly. But if, as soon as a player gains that power, suddenly all your enemies have grenades and shotguns and they just start filling the room with shrapnel, that's a bit of a dick move. So let players have their victories, let them do the thing they built their character to do, and don't immediately use every strategy, every weapon, every power you can to render what they do useless. At the same time, if something does become a known strategy to the villains, it should not be something they're surprised by anymore. So there's some give and take there, particularly if your players end up fighting the same villains over and over again, or at least villains who all work for the same overarching entity, whether you're dealing with loyalists who all serve the same true fae, if you're dealing with pentechs and their security tapes of what your squad is capable of. Enemies should at least know what players are capable of, but you shouldn't immediately start negating what they can do every time they have an encounter, especially if the villains or enemies they're fighting aren't communicating with each other and they have no way of knowing what's on your players' sheets. Second thing that I've seen a lot of storytellers do, and this is normally done out of frustration rather than out of an attempt to make a more challenging game, and if you are feeling frustrated as a storyteller, I recommend you take a deep breath and talk to your players like adults so that you can figure out a way that you can all enjoy the game more. No one ever learned anything by having their characters killed in-game. I say that to preface this because whenever you end up pulling big threats out of nowhere, usually in situations that do not warrant big threats, that's going to feel very frustrating for your players. A good example of this is, say you have players who are going about, maybe they're roughing folks up. Maybe they're trying to gather information in a more thuggish way. Maybe you have individuals committing petty crime or breaking into buildings, whatever it is. If you suddenly have a SWAT team on call, armed to the teeth, ready to show up at a moment's notice to deal with these particular individuals, and there isn't something to warrant that level of readiness on the part of law enforcement, that can very quickly feel like you're just escalating things. Which is not to say that if players have been doing this for a while, if they have a large rap sheet, if the police are looking for them specifically and they are, responding to sightings of your players, sure, call in the big guns, but don't do that immediately as a result of them attempting to do something a little nefarious or a little rough around the edges. It's a good way of signaling to your players that this is less about how the world is reacting to them and more about your frustration as a storyteller. If a threat does happen, if escalation occurs, it should feel natural, it should feel organic, and most importantly, it should feel like this is part of how the world works. This is how things happen. And this goes back to what I suggested in the do's section of 5 or 6 smaller enemies are just as, if not more powerful than 1 or 2 big enemies. A couple squad cars of regular beat cops are going to give your players just as much trouble as a small squad of riot police. Just keep that in mind going forward. And lastly, and this is a big one for World and Chronicles of Darkness games specifically, different from most other RPGs I have seen, and that's because we're all playing monsters, and most of the monsters that we are playing have something they're weak to. For werewolves, it's silver and fire. For vampires, it's the stake through the heart, being set on fire. For changelings, their magic is destroyed and negated by cold iron, and so on and so forth. Those weaknesses exist to sort of add flavor and flair to the game and to offer options, both for how to deal with your own kind and how to make sure that there's an Achilles heel on every single creature out there. But if that weakness is being used every single time players get into combat, pretty soon it can start to suck the fun out of the game. As an example, if you have a group of werewolves who have not been keeping it very secret what they are, who have made themselves very visible, then it makes sense that the people they're messing with, the targets they're going after, might realize, well, if we use silver, that will hurt them, because that's the most obvious thing you think of when it comes to werewolves. If a bunch of people are convinced your character is a vampire, maybe because you told them you're going around and lording it over the mortals, then yeah, they might follow the Hollywood tropes of find where they're sleeping, burn the place down, cut their heads off. It's things that vampires are not going to be able to deal with, especially if they're asleep for the day. But if suddenly every individual that your players encounter knows what they are and knows exactly what their weaknesses are, even if there's no real pop culture or grander mythology explaining that to your average person, pretty soon it starts to feel really cheap. And that's especially true if there's not really repercussions for that weakness being called into question. This is particularly true if you're fighting other supernaturals of your own kind. Oftentimes there are cultural associations with using that weakness that can sort of lose you face amongst your others. It can mean that people don't trust you as much. It can lead to all of these other repercussions. And if those things aren't happening, then it starts to feel extra cheap. And then your players begin to wonder why they're dealing with it at all. Why play this game? Why not play something else entirely where that doesn't happen? And I understand the urge, particularly as someone who has been a storyteller who has played in a lot of games. You want to make sure that your players feel challenged. You want to make sure that when combat does happen, it feels like a threat and it feels like things are going to at least have the potential to seriously hurt the player characters. But there's a time and a place for everything, and most of these are things you should reserve for moments of high tension, when something has gone really wrong, or when something is a serious threat, a serious contender that players really shouldn't underestimate. And a lot of storytellers end up overusing these to the point where they don't feel special anymore, and they feel like it's just another thing they have to deal with, which can really break immersion, and it can really have a negative effect on the game and players as a whole. But that's my 3 do's and don'ts of combat, just to start with. If there's anything I left out, anything that you all feel should be included in either the do or don't section, by all means, leave it in the comments below. And I've asked this before, but is this longer format, this multiple sections, something you all want to see more of? Or is it just making a couple of chunky videos that folks are less interested in overall? And if you do like it, even if you don't, what is a topic you'd like to see in the future? What is something you want a deeper dive, a bigger breakdown on? And do you want a longer one, or do you just want a short video that touches on the highlights that often get forgotten? But that's all for this week. So until next time, happy gaming, everyone.